Close your eyes and picture this. The morning sky above northern Europe, late 1943. A thin mist clings to the horizon. First, a low rumble rolls like distant thunder. Then it grows, steady, relentless, until the very air seems to vibrate. German spotters raise their binoculars, their breath fogging in the cold air. What they see steals the color from their faces. A formation of B-17 flying fortresses, hundreds of them, moves across the sky like a wall of iron. Their tight boxes of formation shine under the pale sun, each bomber bristling with machine guns. For the Luftwaffe, this sight is already an omen of exhaustion. Every raid means hours of desperate interception, every mission drains men and machines. Pilots strap into their cockpits with a familiar weight in their stomachs, the creeping realization that no matter how many fortresses they down, more always come. Now imagine this. Just as the German fighters claw into the sky, ready to sacrifice themselves again in a hopeless ballet of fire and smoke, another shadow joins the battle. Behind the B-17s, almost casually, come the B-24 Liberators, sleeker, faster, carrying payloads just as devastating. For the German pilots, it is like facing the same nightmare twice with no end in sight. Can you feel that despair? The moment when confidence, carefully rehearsed in Nazi propaganda halls, shatters in the cockpit of a Messerschmitt? The oxygen mask tastes of rubber, the fuel gauge drops, tracer fire arcs through the clouds. And still the bombers keep coming, like a factory line of death stretching from England to Berlin. I want you to step into that sky with me. To smell the burning oil, to hear the cough of engines, to see the twisted wrecks spiraling down. To understand not only the tactics and the engineering of the bombers, but the psychology, the breaking point of Luftwaffe aces who once believed they were untouchable. Because this is more than just a clash of machines. It is the slow suffocation of German air power, the moment when the myth of invincibility collapsed under a rain of bombs. And if you stay with me, we'll unravel this story like a cinematic dossier, mission by mission, gun by gun, through flight logs, survivor testimony, and technical blueprints. You will discover why the B-17 earned its name as the Flying Fortress, why the B-24 struck terror not with romance but with cold efficiency, and why together, they forced an entire generation of German pilots to face the unthinkable, that the war was slipping from their skies. So buckle in. Hit that subscribe button if you want to dive deeper into history's most dramatic air battles. Turn on the bell so you don't miss the next mission. And if this story already has your heart racing, leave a like. Because what we're about to explore is not just history. It's the anatomy of despair, written in smoke trails and shattered wings. The first time German pilots faced the massed formations of B-17 flying fortresses, many still clung to an illusion of superiority. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf Fw-190 were sleek predators. Their climb rate and cannons promised easy prey. But as the raids intensified through 1943, this illusion began to rot. The B-17s did not fly like frightened prey. They moved in combat boxes, layers of interlocking fields of fire, so that any attacker diving in found himself caught in a lattice of .50 caliber tracers. Pilots who once boasted of single-handed kills now returned to base with wings shredded and nerves frayed, whispering about the iron wall that refused to fall. Luftwaffe veterans began to write in diaries, "They come like storms and they leave us with nothing but smoke." And then came the second wave of terror, the B-24 Liberator. At first, many Germans underestimated it. Its slab-sided fuselage looked ungainly compared to the fortress-like B-17. Propaganda mocked its appearance, calling it a flying coffin. But reality struck hard. The B-24 was faster, carried heavier loads, and had a longer reach. Suddenly, targets once considered beyond regular bombing range, deep in the Ruhr, Hamburg, even Plosti's vital oil fields, fell within the Americans' grasp. Imagine being a German pilot climbing to intercept, already weary from duels with fortresses, and then spotting an entirely new wave of bombers stretched across the sky. Engines droned like a factory line that never stopped. For every fortress beaten back, a Liberator was waiting, pressing further, striking deeper. It was as if the Reich was being attacked by two fists at once. One steady and indestructible, the other swift and punishing. The summer of 1943 offered one of the starkest demonstrations of this nightmare. The Americans launched a daring mission against Plosti, Romania, heart of Germany's oil lifeline. While B-17s were part of the plan, it was the B-24 Liberators that bore the main weight. Flying perilously low, skimming treetops and smokestacks, they turned the oil refineries into seas of fire. German flak tore many bombers apart, but those that survived delivered devastation no propaganda could mask. For Luftwaffe strategists, the message was brutal. These machines could bleed the Reich dry, even at the cost of horrific losses. Pilots in their cockpits began to feel the weight of inevitability. One diary entry from a Luftwaffe lieutenant described the sensation. You fight the fortresses until your ammunition runs dry. You think maybe you've bought one more day for the fatherland. Then you see the Liberators behind them, another wall, another wave. The air itself seems endless with their shadows. From a technical standpoint, the nightmare was rational. The B-17's defensive armament made it nearly impregnable in formation. The B-24 added endurance and payload, meaning there was no reprieve. Factories repairing Messerschmitts in Regensburg, ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt, and shipyards along the North Sea coast found themselves hammered again and again. Even when German fighters inflicted losses, the replacements poured in faster than they could be destroyed. And here lies the cruel irony. Luftwaffe pilots had been trained to believe in their personal prowess, in the myth of the ace who could alter the course of battle with skill and courage. Against the tide of Liberators, that mythology dissolved. Skill could shoot down one bomber, perhaps two. But what of the other 200 thundering overhead? Heroism turned into futility. Every interception became a suicide pact with mathematics. A handful of fighters against endless squadrons. The despair deepened when German intelligence officers briefed their men with grim arithmetic. Even if half of a formation were lost, the remaining bombers could still flatten a city. And more often than not, losses were far lower. B-24 groups returned battered but intact enough to strike again within days. For the Luftwaffe, there was no rest cycle, no breathing room. Each battle blurred into the next, until fatigue etched permanent shadows beneath young men's eyes. By late 1943, German townspeople noticed the change. Pilots who once swaggered through beer halls now sat silent, nursing drinks with haunted stares. The sound of American engines in the distance made them flinch before scrambling. Civilians whispered that the skies no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. The bombers owned them. And still, more B-24s rolled off American production lines. At Ford's Willow Run plant, a Liberator emerged every 63 minutes, a pace of industrial war no German factory could dream of. For every Messerschmitt destroyed, 10 more Liberators appeared to darken the skies. It was not merely a contest of machines, it was a contest of endurance, and the Germans were beginning to understand they were trapped in a race they could never win. At this stage of the war, despair was no longer just an emotion. It was a calculation. German pilots could see the equation in the sky: fortresses that would not fall, and Liberators that never ceased arriving. The winter of 1943 turned the Reich skies into a stage for relentless American pressure. For the Germans, the first sight of contrails stretching across the heavens had once been a manageable threat, a formation of fortresses, dangerous yet finite. But now those white trails multiplied, weaving into vast rivers of exhaust. B-17s led the way, and behind them, like the echo of a nightmare, the B-24 Liberators poured forward. The fortresses had already carved deep wounds. Regensburg, Schweinfurt, Bremen, industrial nodes critical to the Nazi war machine, lay blackened. Yet where the B-17 hammered steadily, the B-24 carved with a sharper blade. Its longer range meant new targets came under siege. The Ruhr's coal plants, Vienna's factories, and even the distant oil depots of Eastern Europe no longer lay beyond the bomber's grasp. German pilots learned this the hardest way. Many Luftwaffe squadrons rose expecting a single duel. After hours of combat against B-17 formations, fuel gauges dipped toward empty, cannons overheated, arms numbed from recoil. At the very moment they prepared to break away, they saw new squadrons of B-24s entering the fray, their bomb bays brimming, their .50 caliber guns flashing. The despair was not theatrical, it was bone deep. For a man trapped in a Messerschmitt cockpit, oxygen mask biting his face, there was no greater cruelty than realizing the battle had only just begun. Take the January 1944 raids on Frankfurt. Waves of B-17s devastated rail yards and marshalling depots. German fighters clawed desperately, scoring kills but bleeding heavily in return. And then came the Liberators, flying at slightly different altitudes, scattering bombs over factories and chemical plants. Witnesses on the ground recalled a day that seemed endless, punctuated by the whine of falling bombs and the unbroken drone of radial engines. For the Luftwaffe, there was no sense of victory. Even when they claimed dozens of bombers destroyed, the city still burned. The psychological toll mounted quickly. German propaganda insisted the B-24 was clumsy, vulnerable, unworthy of fear. But pilots returning from combat knew better. They spoke of its speed, its unpredictable tactics, its uncanny ability to slip past battered defenses and still unload devastation. One veteran described it bitterly in a letter: "The fortress we could respect as a wall. But the Liberator, he is the thief who steals through the cracks, striking when you are weakest." And in sheer numbers, the Liberator was overwhelming. American industry outproduced every German countermeasure. By 1944, B-24s numbered in the tens of thousands, swarming over Europe like locusts of steel. Against them, Luftwaffe squadrons were increasingly populated by exhausted veterans and half-trained youths. The myth of the German ace, once so proudly broadcast, withered in the face of attrition. Each new recruit knew he was stepping into a cockpit with odds stacked cruelly against him. Consider the raid on Gotha in February 1944. Factories producing critical aircraft components became the target of a mixed B-17 and B-24 strike. The fortresses endured furious interception, their gunners blazing as German fighters dove from the sun. Yet the real blow came when the Liberators arrived moments later, tearing through weakened defenses and plastering Gotha with precision. Within hours, workshops vital to the Luftwaffe's survival lay in ruins. German ground crews, watching the destruction from smoking craters, began whispering what pilots already feared: the Americans had found a weapon of exhaustion, not just destruction. Technically, the Liberator's impact was undeniable. With a top speed near 290 miles per hour and a bomb load exceeding 5,000 pounds, it struck deeper and faster than the fortress. Its Davis wing, thin and long, gave it efficiency that stretched fuel reserves further than most German interceptors could chase. While Luftwaffe pilots fought to conserve every drop of fuel, the Liberator seemed tireless, reaching into the very arteries of German industry. The despair was not confined to the skies. In cities below, civilians recognized the pattern. First came the booming advance guard of B-17s, their bombs thundering on infrastructure. Then, as fires raged and rescue crews scrambled, a second wave arrived. Liberators scattering fresh destruction. Survivors spoke of the hopelessness. It was as if the sky had no end. When we believed the bombing was finished, more came. The ground trembled without pause. To exaggerate the Liberator's force is not to distort history, it is to capture the lived terror. The bomber was not merely a machine, it was a promise of continuity, of inexhaustible assault. For every German pilot forced down with empty fuel tanks, another formation loomed beyond the horizon. For every city barely beginning to smother flames, another strike descended. The cycle was mechanical, industrial, merciless. By mid-1944, Luftwaffe squadrons were shadows of their former selves. The defensive shield that had once protected the Reich's industrial heartland was cracked. The B-24 Liberator, once derided, had become the very embodiment of American persistence. Each raid carried not just bombs but a message written in smoke: resistance was futile, exhaustion inevitable. In this theater of attrition, German pilots were no longer warriors, they were men fighting tides. And against the endless tide of Liberators, every flight was less a mission of defense than a ritual of despair. By the summer of 1944, the Reich sky had become an assembly line of destruction. The Luftwaffe was no longer an air force of dominance, it was a battered shield riddled with holes. And into those gaps poured the Liberators. The D-Day campaign marked the turning point. In the weeks leading up to the Allied invasion, American bombers were tasked not only with crippling German cities but also with dismantling rail networks, bridges, and troop concentrations across France. The B-24 Liberator, with its long range and massive bomb load, became indispensable. While the B-17s pummeled rail yards and supply depots in northern France, squadrons of Liberators ranged further, blasting bridges across the Seine, reducing marshalling yards at Lyon, and cutting communications with ruthless efficiency. 4 German pilots scrambling to intercept, this expansion of the battlefield was a nightmare. Once they had been able to predict the rhythm of fortress raids. Now, Liberators struck in unpredictable patterns, hitting both near and far, day and night. The sky felt omnipresent, as though American industry had filled the heavens with iron birds that simply never tired. On June 6, 1944, as Allied soldiers stormed the beaches, B-24s loomed overhead in terrifying numbers. They did not duel with fighters. They simply erased the battlefield below. Coastal gun emplacements, reserves moving to counterattack, supply columns on French roads, all were chewed into ash by Liberator bombs. Luftwaffe pilots attempting interception found themselves not hunters but gnats, swatting uselessly at a storm. The despair was visceral. One German ace reportedly muttered over the radio, "This is not war. This is drowning." The raids grew bolder. With air superiority slipping, the Americans began sending Liberators deeper into Germany's industrial arteries. Targets that had once seemed untouchable now lay naked beneath their bomb bays. Stuttgart's automobile factories, Munich's transport hubs, even Berlin itself, all reeled under Liberator blows. The raid on Kiel in July 1944 exemplified the shift. German defenses had been eroded by months of attrition. When the bombers came, fortresses first, then Liberators, what little opposition the Luftwaffe could mount was scattered. Shipyards that had once built U-boats, symbols of Germany's maritime reach, vanished under sheets of fire. Civilians watched from bunkers as the sky cracked open, the droning engines of B-24s delivering what felt like divine retribution. Psychologically, the effect was catastrophic. Propaganda ministers had promised that every bomber would pay in blood. But the sight of Liberator formations surviving interception, regrouping and returning the next day tore those promises apart. Even the most loyal pilots began to whisper doubts. Diaries revealed a recurring phrase, "We cannot stop them. We can only die trying." The despair was magnified by a cruel truth. The Liberator was not just another bomber. It was a symbol of inexhaustible supply. For every one shot down in flames, another rolled out of Willow Run's assembly lines within the hour. Germany's scattered factories, bombed and fragmented, could not hope to match this industrial torrent. Each combat report seemed to confirm the futility. Dozens of aircraft lost, hundreds of gallons of precious fuel consumed, yet the city still burned. From a technical standpoint, the mismatch was absolute. The Liberators' ability to carry payloads exceeding 5,000 pounds at ranges over 2,000 miles meant that Germany's last refuges, oil fields, synthetic fuel plants and hidden depots, could be struck with precision. Even when weather forced dispersal, the Liberators adapted, dropping bombs in staggered waves that prolonged the terror. For defenders on the ground, there was no rhythm to predict, no pause to recover. German civilians felt it most acutely. Survivors described nights when the world seemed to shudder in endless echoes. One witness from Hamburg recalled, "The sound never stopped. We thought the raid was finished. Then came another. And another. It was not an air attack. It was a punishment without end." For Luftwaffe leadership, each raid forced a grim calculation. Should they commit dwindling fuel and pilots to interceptations they knew would fail? Or conserve resources and watch their cities burn? Either choice fed despair. The B-24's relentless presence transformed every strategy into a dilemma, every mission into a confession of weakness. By autumn, the Reich sky was a corridor of inevitability. Columns of fortresses hammered one target, Liberators struck another, and behind them, escorting P-51 Mustangs swatted down what remained of German resistance. Pilots who once soared with arrogance now climbed with dread, knowing each sortie could end in fire or captivity. In the barracks the tone shifted. Gone were the triumphant toasts after sorties. Instead silence spread. Men smoked cigarettes down to the filter, staring at the floor, haunted by the knowledge that tomorrow would bring another wave of Liberators, and the day after that, more still. The sky no longer offered glory. It offered only despair. And the Liberators kept coming. Like an assembly line of thunder, they filled the horizon, blotting out hope with their shadow. For Germany's airmen, there was no defense against infinity. By late 1944, the B-24 Liberator had become more than a machine of war. To German pilots, it was a prophecy in aluminum, an omen that no matter how hard they fought, the sky itself had been conquered. The Reich still spoke of miracle weapons, rockets, jet fighters, new tanks, but in the cockpits of the Luftwaffe, men whispered only of exhaustion. They were being ground down not by a single weapon, but by the endless rhythm of the Liberators' advance. The raids on synthetic fuel plants drove this truth home. Without oil, even the finest Messerschmitts were reduced to museum pieces. In the fall of 1944, Liberator formations spearheaded the destruction of plants at Luna and Merseburg. Escorts swept away the few fighters left, while bombs turned refining towers into skeletal wrecks. German mechanics begged for fuel, but there was none. Pilots sat idle on runways, their machines grounded while B-24s droned overhead, scattering yet more bombs. The despair spread outward. Civilians, once told that their flak guns and their Luftwaffe would hold the skies, now crouched in shelters, waiting for the next tremor. They noticed something chilling. The raids were no longer occasional punishments but a daily certainty. One survivor wrote in her journal, "We measure life not by days but by raids. Morning raid, afternoon raid, night raid. The sky is a clock and its hands are bombers." Consider the destruction of Dresden in February 1945. Though British night raids carried much of the blame, it was Liberators that joined in daylight assaults, sealing the city's fate. The firestorm consumed tens of thousands and German morale collapsed further. For Luftwaffe pilots who survived the inferno in the air, the message was stark. Not even cultural treasures would be spared. If Dresden could burn, any city could. Technically, the power of the Liberator was amplified by precision. Equipped with the Norden bomb sight, formations could rain destruction with surgical accuracy. Bridges vital to Wehrmacht supply chains vanished. Factories producing ball bearings, already battered in Schweinfurt, ceased to function entirely. Railway marshalling yards, once the arteries of German logistics, became smoking craters. Where the B-17 had been a hammer, the B-24 was a scalpel, cutting deeper, faster, with devastating consequences. For the Luftwaffe, the psychological toll was unbearable. Veteran commanders admitted privately that they no longer controlled the air war. They fought not for victory but for delay, praying for a miracle that never came. Each sortie against the Liberators meant facing swarms of .50 caliber fire, P-51 escorts, and the unshakable truth, even if they brought down 1 or 2 hundreds more remained. By spring 1945, as Allied armies closed on Berlin, the Liberators' role shifted from strategic devastation to tactical dominance. Bombers flattened rail hubs to prevent reinforcements, shredded retreating columns and erased defensive strongpoints. The Luftwaffe barely stirred. Fuel shortages and catastrophic losses had clipped its wings. The skies belonged entirely to the Americans, and the B-24 Liberator was its vanguard. For German pilots, despair had hardened into resignation. Diaries told of men climbing into cockpits with shaking hands, already convinced they would not return. Others avoided missions altogether, claiming illness, sabotaging takeoffs, or quietly deserting. The myth of the invincible fighter pilot was dead. In its place was the truth of attrition. No skill could defeat production lines that birthed bombers faster than they could be destroyed. On the ground, civilians watched their world disintegrate from above. Cities once symbols of culture and power were reduced to ash. Rail lines twisted like broken spines. Bridges lay shattered across rivers. The economy, the war machine, even the morale of the people, all were obliterated by the constant drumbeat of raids. And always, among the fortresses, there flew the Liberators, swifter and heavier, the second wave that never ended. This was the true cruelty of the B-24. It was not only its bombs, not only its guns, but its promise of continuity. To see a Liberator was to know another raid would follow, and another after that, until nothing remained. It was the embodiment of inevitability. For Luftwaffe pilots, it was the sound of surrender approaching. For civilians, it was the sky's declaration that the Reich was finished. By the war's end, more than 18,000 Liberators had flown. They struck every corner of Germany's industrial and military heartland, from Hamburg's shipyards to Munich's factories. They cut rail lines, erased oil supplies, and turned cities into ruins. They were not graceful, not romanticized like the fortress, but they were relentless, the second hammer that ensured Germany could never rise from its knees. And so the despair of German pilots was sealed. First, the B-17 had taught them futility. Then the B-24 taught them inevitability. Together they broke not just wings but spirits. In the end, the Luftwaffe did not collapse because it lacked courage. It collapsed because no courage could withstand infinity. The Liberator was infinity in steel. In the smoky bars of ruined German towns, Luftwaffe pilots once laughed at the flying fortress. They mocked its heavy frame, its slow turns, its ungainly silhouette. They called it a lumbering beast, a target so large that even a half-trained cadet could hit it. Those early jeers now echoed like ghosts, cruel reminders of arrogance. Because as the war ground on, the joke curdled into regret. The fortress had proved indestructible in formation, and then behind it came the B-24 Liberator, swifter, heavier, and more numerous. The regret was personal. Diaries discovered after the war captured the tone. One German lieutenant confessed, "We laughed at the flying fortress. Now I feel the laughter burning in my throat. The Liberator is not a joke. It is our end." What once seemed like overconfidence from the Americans had become an unending nightmare. For every bomber destroyed, 5 more appeared. For every victory, 10 defeats followed. The despair was compounded by a question whispered in briefing rooms and bunkers. How can they have so many? Pilots who had grown up on tales of German efficiency could not fathom an enemy producing machines faster than bullets could destroy them. The answer lay not in tactics, not in luck, but in industry. While German factories were scattered, bombed, and limited by resource shortages, America's industrial heart pulsed with inexhaustible energy. In Michigan, the Ford Willow Run plant turned out a new Liberator every 63 minutes, faster than a soldier could smoke a cigarette and write a letter home. Across the continent, factories in San Diego, Tulsa, and Fort Worth did the same. The Reich depended on slave laborers working under the crack of whips. The United States relied on assembly lines humming with oil and steel, powered by an economy untouched by bombing. For the Luftwaffe, this imbalance was unbearable. They could fight skill with skill, plane against plane, but they could not fight infinity. They watched as squadrons of bombers filled the sky in endless streams, stretching horizon to horizon. One German ace compared it bitterly, "It is like emptying the ocean with a cup." The industrial disparity was not simply a matter of numbers. It shaped the psychology of the war. German pilots climbed into cockpits knowing their aircraft were fragile, often short of fuel, sometimes fitted with replacement parts scavenged from wrecks. Meanwhile, American crews strapped into bombers fresh from assembly, with radios, oxygen, and machine guns gleaming. The contrast was brutal. One side fought with dwindling scraps, the other with overflowing abundance. By late 1944, Germany's industrial base lay in ruins. Coal shipments faltered, synthetic fuel plants smoldered, and rail networks cracked under repeated bombardment. The Reich, once proud of its engineering, could no longer meet even the basic demands of its armies. Ammunition grew scarce, vehicles sat idle, and aircraft often never left the ground. Against this backdrop, the Liberators symbolized more than destruction. They symbolized humiliation. The Americans, by contrast, stood on the shoulders of a continent. Oil fields in Texas and California fed engines by the millions. Steel from Pittsburgh and coal from Appalachia poured into furnaces day and night. Civilian factories retooled for war, turning typewriter plants into weapons workshops, car assembly lines into aircraft hangars. The sheer scale dwarfed German imagination. Where Germany could manage hundreds, America produced tens of thousands. This imbalance framed the despair of the Luftwaffe. In their minds, the war had become unwinnable not because they lacked courage but because the enemy had tapped into an industrial ocean. The very concept of attrition, once Germany's weapon in 1914, had turned against them. They were the ones being bled dry, their every effort swallowed by a machine that stretched across oceans. On the front lines, this truth was unavoidable. German soldiers in trenches watched the bombers pass overhead, wave after wave, and asked aloud the question their leaders refused to answer: how can one nation build so much? The silence that followed was more damning than any speech. Thus the context of despair solidified. On one side Germany, scarred by bombing, starved of fuel, reliant on fading myths of superiority. On the other, the United States, industrial giant, ocean fortress, able to flood Europe's skies with endless squadrons of bombers. The B-17 had opened the wound, the B-24 drove the blade deeper. This was the stage as the war neared its climax. Germany was trapped between a crumbling industrial base and a sky dominated by American abundance. Every bomber raid became not only an attack on factories and railways but also a psychological assault, reminding pilots and civilians alike that the Reich was fighting a war it could never win. The despair of Luftwaffe pilots was not just about death in the skies. It was about futility, about realizing that their courage, their skill, their sacrifice were powerless against a nation that built bombers as casually as Germany built bicycles. They had mocked the fortress. They had dismissed the Liberator. Now, as their world collapsed, they could only regret the arrogance that blinded them to the storm that was always coming. The Liberator's superiority was not a single brilliant trick. It was a constellation of modest advantages that, when added together, became overwhelming. Think of the B-24 as a long, tireless river and the B-17 as a mountain dam. Both move water, but one floods a continent by persistence while the other holds and redirects with toughness. That difference, persistence versus armor, explains why German pilots, once scoffing, found themselves flung into a new kind of terror. Start with the skeleton. The B-24 used the Davis high-aspect wing, a thin, long airfoil that turned fuel into distance. Where other designs drank gasoline greedily, this wing stretched every gallon into miles. In practical terms, the Liberator could reach targets that put the fortress on the edge of its envelope. It could carry heavier loads at greater ranges with less penalty. For Luftwaffe planners, range stopped being an academic number and became a question of which cities would still be there tomorrow. Speed and climb made the Liberator a harder puzzle to pin down. On paper, top speeds of the two types were close, but the B-24's cruise efficiency and sustained dash allowed formations to keep tempo, cross hostile windows quickly, and sometimes slip through interception corridors before fighters could mass. The B-17's virtues lay elsewhere, a beefier airframe and structural redundancy that gave it a higher ceiling and remarkable survivability when hit. Pilots who loved to trade stories favored the fortress because it could take punishment and still limp home. But experience in 1943-44 showed that survivability mattered little if waves of bombers never stopped arriving. Payload decisions were a conversation in arithmetic. Both machines could carry several thousand pounds. Both could, on short sorties, haul impressively large loads. The Liberator, however, offered flexibility. Commanders could trade a little internal fuel to add more ordnance, or vice versa, and still reach strategic depths. That flexibility translated into strategic options. Strike oil in Romania one week, peer the Ruhr the next, without retooling the logistics chain. For German defenders, that meant the map of safe targets shrank day by day. Defensive arrangements produced different tactical portraits in the air. The flying fortress defended itself by geometry, tight boxes, interlocking fields of fire, an orchestra of turrets that turned the sky into a bristling hedge. The Liberator relied on a mix of gun coverage and speed efficiency to reduce exposure time over targets. Put another way, the B-17 asked an attacker to run a gauntlet. The B-24 reduced the length of the gauntlet while still packing a punch. To a Messerschmitt closing in, either choice was dangerous. But the Liberator's ability to change where and when the gauntlet appeared multiplied the Luftwaffe's dilemma. Now fold industry into the machine. Aircraft performance without production is like a sword without smiths. America did not just design effective heavy bombers. It organized men, plants, materials, and capital so the machines could be produced in unprecedented quantities. Where Germany's supply lines choked, American assembly lines sang. Entire automotive factories were reshaped into aircraft factories. Jigs, presses, subassembly lines, and standardized parts turned once slow processes into a rhythm. Raw aluminum to finished bomber in months, crews trained en masse, spares stocked in abundance. The math becomes stark. Hundreds of airframes a month, thousands a year, an industrial tide that mechanical skill alone could not stem. The Norden bombsight and other avionics deserve a short note because they changed how bombs mattered. Better sighting and coordinated formation bombing made each sortie more efficient. Not every mission relied on brute tonnage. Many relied on accurate placement, a surgical strike that multiplied the destructive return on each aircraft. That meant fewer sorties could still inflict strategic paralysis. When you combine surgical accuracy with long range and sustained sorties, the result is predictable. Near constant pressure on production and logistics nodes. A human-level consequence followed. Luftwaffe pilots learned to calculate attrition not as an abstract percentage but as a temporal equation. How many sorties could they intercept before the enemy's production replaced aircraft and crews? The Liberator's endurance shifted that equation sharply. It was not merely harder to shoot down, it was harder to make a tactical success matter because the strategic flow compensated for losses faster than Germany could respond. Finally, imagine the operational tempo. Bombers that can reach farther, carry more, and return to strike again within days forced a defender into a pointless rhythm. Scramble, intercept, repair, wait, repeat. That repetition, multiplied across months, exhausted fuel and men, damaged infrastructure, and eroded morale. The Liberator did not always appear as a spectacular killer in a single duel, it appeared as an industrial truth, abundance delivered with unglamorous efficiency. That combination, design efficiency married to manufacturing scale, was what made the B-24 less a plane and more a doctrine. Strike until nothing worth striking remains. To understand why the Liberator struck despair deeper than the Fortress, one must look beyond airframe and into numbers. Numbers that breathed like armies. Consider altitude. The B-17 could soar higher, often operating near 35,000 feet, where German flak struggled to reach. The B-24, designed with efficiency in mind, typically worked several thousand feet lower. On paper, this should have been a disadvantage. In practice, however, it meant the Liberator's bomb loads carried more kinetic energy when they struck, tearing deeper into hardened targets. To a German factory manager, the distinction was not academic. A higher percentage of bombs penetrated roofs, craters spread wider, machinery was mangled beyond repair. Range was the other blade of the Liberator's scythe. At full load, it could cover more than 2,000 miles, stretching its reach from English bases into the far corners of the Reich. Oil refineries in Ploesti, chemical plants in Upper Silesia, and even transport nodes near Vienna, all fell within its grasp. German planners, once comfortable in the illusion that geography offered a buffer, suddenly faced the reality that no corner of Europe was beyond American steel. The map itself became hostile. Fuel efficiency also created a tempo the Luftwaffe could not match. Each gallon burned by a Bf-109 or FW-190 was irreplaceable in 1944. Each gallon burned by a B-24 was one of millions, sustained by vast refineries and shipping convoys across the Atlantic. The disparity was cruel. The Reich measured its fuel in days, the Americans in years. Armament told another story of inevitability. Both the B-17 and B-24 bristled with heavy .50 caliber Browning M2s, weapons that spat a rain of lead dense enough to saw wings from fighters. The Liberator's defensive arcs overlapped in ways that made a single pass perilous. A German ace once complained, "You fire once and 10 gunners answer. You dive again and 20 reply. You cannot reach the heart of the beast without flying through fire." But firepower alone was not decisive. It was repairability and replacement. A Liberator damaged in combat could often be patched up in days and returned to the sky. A Liberator lost entirely was replaced by another, rolling off Willow Run's endless conveyor. The B-24 was not a monument to invincibility, it was a statement that individual losses meant nothing. And for the Luftwaffe, that truth was unbearable. To fight a machine that can be infinitely replaced is to fight despair itself. Industrial power gave form to this despair. In Germany, aircraft factories relied on forced labor, dispersed facilities, and fragile supply chains vulnerable to bombing. One raid could cripple an entire month's output. In America, factories ran like symphonies. Women riveting panels, men welding spars, trains shuttling parts from coast to coast. A Liberator every hour was not propaganda, it was the hum of machinery, the rhythm of shift bells, the discipline of scale. What if Germany had matched this output? A thought experiment. If the Reich could have produced as many fighters as the Allies produced bombers, the air war might have slowed, perhaps even shifted. But no such balance was possible. Even at peak, German industry lagged behind in raw materials, workforce capacity, and logistical safety. Bombs rained on their factories, while across the Atlantic, Detroit and San Diego never heard a siren. The technical duel thus collapsed into an industrial duel. The B-17 embodied durability, the B-24 embodied reach and volume, and together they embodied the promise that no fortress, no city, no plant, no fuel line, could remain standing. To German pilots, it felt as if they were not fighting aircraft but entire continents. Picture a Messerschmitt pilot, climbing through cloud, oxygen mask pressing against his face. Ahead, a dark formation looms. His heart tells him, fortress. His eyes strain, and then he sees the sleeker outline, the deeper shadows, the wings longer and thinner. It is a Liberator. Behind it, another. Behind that, an endless stream. His instruments show fuel dwindling. His guns are warm, his body cold. He asks the question every German pilot eventually asked. Why do they never stop? The answer is in steel mills he will never see, in assembly lines he cannot imagine, in the unbroken hum of a nation that builds war as if it were peace. The Liberator was not a miracle of design alone. It was the embodiment of industrial war. Machines multiplied until they became inevitability. Against such inevitability, skill, courage, and sacrifice dissolved into statistics. And statistics, not aces, won the sky. The duel between Germany's Luftwaffe and America's bomber fleets was never simply about metal in the sky. It was about perception, how each side believed the war would unfold. And in this theater, the Luftwaffe committed a fatal sin. They believed their skill could outweigh numbers, that courage could defy industry. From the earliest encounters, German pilots scoffed at the fortress. They thought of it as a lumbering beast, incapable of graceful combat. In their worldview, nimble fighters always triumphed over bombers. And for a brief time in 1942, this illusion seemed intact. Luftwaffe aces slashed into bomber formations, downing planes with bursts of cannon fire. Victories filled propaganda pages. Yet those pages did not print the truth. Each lost bomber was swiftly replaced, each destroyed crew filled by another. The Reich counted kills, the Americans counted production. Only one side understood which numbers truly mattered. The introduction of the B-24 magnified this miscalculation. German intelligence initially dismissed it as inferior to the B-17, less robust, more vulnerable. They failed to see that robustness mattered little when numbers and reach compensated. The B-24 extended the battlefield into territories Germany assumed were safe. Refineries, depots, and factories that had been mere lines on distant maps suddenly became smoking ruins. This was not just a machine, it was a new geometry of war. Strategically, the Luftwaffe misjudged the balance between pilot quality and industrial might. They invested in the cult of the ace, producing legends like Galland and Hartmann. But no ace, however skilled, could alter the arithmetic of attrition. Shooting down a bomber might save a bridge for a day. It did not stop the 1,000 more Liberators on the assembly lines. Germany worshipped the duel, America worshipped the factory. And factories proved more decisive than duels. Another miscalculation lay in resource allocation. Germany poured effort into developing wonder weapons, jets, rockets, massive cannons, while starving its air defense infrastructure. They underestimated how quickly the Allies would achieve daylight bombing precision. While V-2 rockets terrorized civilians, Liberators calmly dismantled synthetic fuel plants. The Reich chased spectacle, America pursued consistency. And consistency, multiplied by thousands, broke the Reich's spine. Technically, comparisons reveal the cruel irony. The B-17 could take astonishing punishment, earning its reputation as the indestructible flying fortress. The B-24, though more fragile in some respects, brought flexibility and speed. Together they created a two-headed hydra. Attacked the fortress and the Liberator struck deeper. Attacked the Liberator and the fortress endured longer. For German pilots, every tactic seemed to find its counter. The Reich's faith in tactical brilliance could not overcome the strategic chokehold. On the ground, German commanders made their own errors. They believed dispersal of industry would shield production. Yet dispersal only provided more targets. American long-range bombers had the fuel to seek them out, turning scattered factories into scattered craters. They assumed flak belts would deter raids. Instead, American crews adapted, refining formations, adjusting altitudes, and returning again and again. Each German adaptation was met with overwhelming persistence. Perhaps the deepest mistake, though, was psychological. Germany underestimated the American will to wage industrial war. They imagined the United States as soft, unwilling to accept casualties, incapable of sustained campaigns. They failed to see a nation mobilizing with cold efficiency, a society that turned consumer goods into engines of destruction. Where Germany thought fragility, America demonstrated relentlessness. The Luftwaffe's despair was born not only from enemy planes but from shattered assumptions. By 1944, the contrast was unavoidable. German fighters dwindled, their fuel drained, their pilots exhausted. Meanwhile, Liberators and Fortresses crossed the sky in vast armadas, escorted by P-51s that swept away the last vestiges of resistance. The Reich's leaders promised miracles, but the men in cockpits knew the truth. The miracle belonged to the assembly line. Comparisons etched themselves into memory. A single German fighter took weeks to build, trained months to fly, and consumed precious fuel to maintain. A single B-24 rolled out in under an hour, staffed by crews trained with methodical speed, refueled from reservoirs the Reich could only envy. In the cold ledger of war, Germany's arithmetic was hopeless. Thus the Luftwaffe's tragedy was not merely defeat but miscalculation. They believed bravery could bend mathematics, that skill could crush industry. But history is merciless. It favors the side that can replace faster than it loses. The Americans built war like a factory product, and the Liberator became its emblem. In the end, the Luftwaffe's greatest mistake was to underestimate inevitability. They thought the battle was about aircraft. It was about industry. They thought it was about courage. It was about scale. And in that misjudgment, they doomed themselves to watch the sky darken, not with fate, but with the endless wings of Liberators. The defeat of the Luftwaffe was not sealed in a single day, nor by a single raid. It was sealed gradually through exhaustion. Each B-17 and B-24 raid was a hammer blow, not just against steel and concrete, but against the will of a nation. The consequences reached beyond bomb craters. They reshaped psychology, society, and the very way wars would be fought in the future. For German pilots, the most immediate consequence was despair solidified into resignation. Early in the war they flew with swagger, convinced of their superiority. By 1944, that swagger had evaporated. Instead, they strapped into cockpits with a heaviness that felt like walking toward execution. Diaries revealed an erosion of identity. One pilot wrote, "We are no longer hunters. We are flies in a storm, waiting to be swatted." The Luftwaffe's culture of aces and heroism had collapsed under the weight of attrition. This despair infected German society. Civilians once gathered on rooftops to cheer returning squadrons. Now they huddled in shelters, clutching children as bombs rained down day after day. The knowledge that the Reich's vaunted air force could not protect them shattered trust in leadership. Goebbels' propaganda machine could not mask the truth. If the sky belonged to America, then the war was lost. Rumors spread in factories and bread lines. The Americans have more planes than we have bread. In such whispers lay the seeds of defeat. Economically, the devastation was systemic. Liberators and Fortresses dismantled the Reich's capacity to wage modern war. Synthetic fuel plants lay in ruins, leaving tanks and trucks stranded. Ball-bearing factories ceased production, crippling aircraft assembly. Rail lines twisted into useless wreckage, preventing supplies from reaching the front. The German war machine became a skeleton without muscles, a giant unable to move. Even the vaunted panzer divisions, once unstoppable, sat idle for lack of gasoline. Strategically, the air campaign revealed a truth that shocked even Allied planners. Industry could be as decisive as armies. The bombing did not win the war alone. Soviet armies and Allied landings ensured that. But without fuel, railways, and production, Germany could not resist those armies effectively. Every tank destroyed at the front was matched by 10 that never reached it, because the factories behind the lines were smoking craters. The consequences extended beyond the war itself. For the first time in history, air power had proven it could decide the fate of nations. The age of the bomber had arrived. Military doctrines around the world shifted. Where once generals measured strength in divisions and artillery, now they counted wings of bombers and squadrons of fighters. Cities were no longer sanctuaries, they were front lines. Civilians were no longer bystanders, they were targets. The psychological scar of this truth would shape global strategy for decades. For Germany, the lessons were bitter. Their over-reliance on fighter aces, their faith in wonder weapons, and their failure to match Allied industrial production became case studies in miscalculation. Historians would later argue that even if Germany had built more jets or rockets, the sheer scale of American industry would have smothered them. The Liberator was not just a bomber, it was a symbol of inevitability, a reminder that no tactical brilliance could overcome strategic imbalance. For the United States, the success of the Liberator confirmed the power of industrial war. Willow Run and other factories demonstrated that victory lay in scale, coordination, and relentless supply. This philosophy carried into the Cold War, where the American military-industrial complex became the backbone of deterrence. The B-24 was followed by the B-29 Superfortress, then by jet bombers capable of carrying nuclear payloads. Each generation built upon the lesson: quantity, precision, and endurance mattered as much as courage. On a human level, the consequences were more complex. American crews celebrated survival and victory, but they bore scars. Flying through flak, watching comrades fall in flames, enduring freezing altitudes, all left memories that haunted men long after the war. For Germans, the trauma was deeper still: to see cities erased, families buried, and the sky transformed into an executioner left wounds that would take generations to heal. In cultural memory, the B-24 never achieved the romance of the B-17. The Fortress had the glamour of invincibility, the Hollywood aura of legends like Memphis Belle. The Liberator was plainer, less elegant, sometimes even disliked by its own crews for its cramped fuselage and tricky handling. Yet history reveals the paradox: the less romantic bomber was the more devastating. Its very lack of glamour reflected its true power: utilitarian, efficient, relentless. The Liberator did not symbolize heroism, it symbolized inevitability. The Luftwaffe's collapse carried one final, ironic consequence. By forcing Germany into a defensive crouch, the bombers prevented resources from flowing east to the Eastern Front. Soviet armies, grinding their way toward Berlin, faced fewer aircraft, fewer tanks, fewer supplies. The skies above Russia cleared as the skies above Germany darkened. In this way, the Liberator not only shattered the Reich at home but also cleared the path for Allied victory abroad. When the war ended, the numbers spoke for themselves. Over 18,000 B-24s had been built, more than any other American bomber of the war. They had flown millions of miles, dropped countless tons of bombs, and forced an enemy once feared for its efficiency into collapse. Their legacy was not only in ruins but in the strategic doctrines that followed. Wars would no longer be decided only by soldiers on the ground, but by the factories that supplied the skies. Thus the consequences of the B-24 campaign were twofold: immediate destruction of the Reich's ability to fight, and long-term transformation of how nations understood war. German pilots collapsed not because they lacked courage, but because they faced inevitability. Civilians despaired not because they doubted their resilience, but because they saw the sky filled with infinity. And the world learned that in the age of industrial war, despair itself could be manufactured, shipped, and dropped like bombs. The Liberator had done more than bomb cities. It had changed the future. The sky over Europe told a story of arrogance, despair, and inevitability. German pilots once laughed at the bulky flying fortress, certain that their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs would slice it apart. They believed in aces, in skill, in the myth of individual heroism. But history punished their laughter. The B-17 proved unbreakable in formation, and then came the B-24, faster, longer-ranged, produced in numbers beyond imagination. What began as mockery ended as silence in cockpit diaries, silence in shelters, silence in cities that smoldered day after day. The lesson was not only military but human. Courage alone could not bend the laws of industry. A single pilot could shoot down a bomber, but could he shoot down 10,000? The Luftwaffe discovered the answer in smoke and fire. American factories, untouched by war, churned out machines as if they were toys. German factories, crippled by bombing and shortages, could not keep pace. In that imbalance lay the fate of nations. The Liberator's legacy is not one of glamour but of inevitability. It lacked the fortress's romance, but it carried the weight of reality. It did not need to be loved by its crews to be feared by its enemies. It was the second wave, the shadow behind the fortress, the symbol that despair could be manufactured on an assembly line. It embodied the lesson that in modern war, numbers and persistence crush myths of invincibility. For us today, the story resonates as a caution. Overconfidence is easy when victories are fresh and illusions still glitter. But the B-24 reminds us that arrogance is brittle. The German pilots who once jeered found themselves staring at horizons filled with liberators, their laughter turned to ash. Strength is not measured in moments of triumph but in the ability to sustain, adapt, and endure. And that is why this story matters beyond the war itself. It is not simply about aircraft or bombs. It is about how nations collapse when they underestimate the power of scale, and how despair is born not from sudden defeats but from endless waves of inevitability. So as we close this journey through skies of fire, I invite you to carry the lesson forward, that arrogance can blind, industry can decide, and inevitability can crush even the proudest wings. If this story gripped you, if you could hear the engines, see the shadows, feel the despair of men trapped in cockpits, then stay with us. Subscribe to the channel to explore more untold histories. Ring the bell so you don't miss the next descent into the past. And if you found meaning here, leave a like. Every click helps this history take flight again, reminding the world of lessons written not in textbooks but in smoke trails and shattered steel. History is a sky we must keep watching. The Liberator has spoken. Will we listen?